On October 25th, 1415, near Calais, one of the most famous battles of the Middle Ages took place, the Battle of Agincourt. On that day, the English army of Henry V faced a French force almost 5 times superior. Agincourt is one of the great moments of the 100 Years' War, a titanic confrontation between the Crown of England and the Crown of France that lasted more than a century, although the medieval people never considered it as a single conflict. It was, in fact, a set of wars separated by several truces. In this context, Henry V, English king of the House of Lancaster, was the one who initiated and led the last great stage of the war. As his ancestors had already done, Henry V championed his rights to the throne of France in order to justify a campaign of conquest. His objective was to recover the English power over Normandy, a territory located in the north of France that had been a domain of the kings of England, but that had been 200 years under the powers of the French kings. Henry V, moreover, was born to fight. Not only did he lack fear of death, but he loved war. Henry was a born warrior who had been forged from a young age on the battlefield, where he had been knighted at the age of only 12. It must be borne in mind that England was going through a turbulent time. His father, Henry IV, had come to power by dethroning the Plantagenets by force and lacked legitimacy, which triggered a civil conflict between his supporters and the defenders of the old Plantagenet dynasty. It is in this context that an event took place that reveals the profile of Henry V with lapidary force. When he was only 14 years old, his father sent him to fight against the supporters of the old monarchy, who had risen alongside the Welsh. In that battle, the young Henry almost died on the field. He probably wore the visor of his helmet raised, which was common in order to be able to observe the evolution of the combat and to give orders to his knights. Because of this, during the heat of the combat, an arrow struck him in the face below the eye, leaving the tip between the brain and the ear just millimeters away from causing his death. There on the battlefield, a surgeon cut open his face and removed the tip with tweezers, without anesthesia, of course. Surprisingly, Henry survived, although he was left with a scar for life. However, contrary to what one might think, the young man did not hate the war and did not avoid further confrontations. On the contrary, he even confronted his father because the latter prevented him from starting the war against France. Henry V thought only of launching a war against the French, and of course, once his father was dead and he had ascended to the throne, Henry was quick to find the perfect occasion to launch this heroic campaign against France. At the time of 1415, France was not in favorable times. It was ruled by Charles VI, a weak king who thought his body was made of glass. Worse still, it was embroiled in a civil war between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. The French crown was a vulnerable power, and the English king, who was as brave as he was intelligent, set out on his expedition. Without hesitation, he called up his army and crossed the English Channel. At last, his time had come. However, in order to attack France, it was necessary to cross the English Channel. Henry V crossed the sea at the head of a fleet of 1,500 ships and landed at Normandy, surprising the French, who were convinced that the landing would take place at Calais, further north. Immediately afterwards, the British laid siege to Harfleur, which controlled the most important port of the English Channel. The French, without support, surrendered the town after a 5-week siege. The campaign could not have begun with greater success, but then problems began to arise. Those 5 weeks of hard siege had taken their toll on the English army, stricken by disease, starvation, and desertions. As if this were not enough, in October, autumn burst in with torrential rains that further weakened the English, so Henry decided to retreat north to reorganize the troops and rest. The plan was sound, but the English would never get a chance to carry it out. This time, the French reacted in time and assembled a huge army to cut Henry off on his arduous march to Calais. The French troops knocked down riverbanks, put up stakes and did everything possible to hinder the march of the English, who soon realized that they could end up surrounded by the enemy. Suddenly, that glorious expedition took on the appearance of a desperate retreat in the rain. With an army decimated by dysentery, Henry's only hope was to get past the powerful French force and reach Calais under English rule before being overtaken by the French. Otherwise, he and his men would be annihilated. On the 25th of October, 1415, when the reduced English force was only 50 kilometers from Calais, the French overtook them. The two contingents met in the woods of Agincourt, very close to Crécy, the site of the mythical English victory over the French years before. But this time it seemed impossible to reproduce the outcome of that other battle. Now the English force numbered only about 9,000 soldiers, most of them foot archers, sickly and with little armor. In front of them, a formidable French army of about 25,000 well-rested and well-equipped men were ready to finish them off. Everything seemed to be going wrong for the English. We can imagine the scene. With their feet sunk in the mud and under a laden autumn sky, the flimsy bodies of the English archers would look like tragic silhouettes in front of the French cavalry with their huge war horses and metal-clad horsemen. The French decided to attack first. They did, once again, the typical strategy of the medieval French cavalry, always so proud of their fame and grandiloquence, charging madly as if the battlefield were a gigantic palanquet of a tournament, and that was their big mistake. The famous English archers, stuck to the ground behind makeshift wooden stakes, raised their person-sized longbows and began to shoot skywards. These men, unimpressive to look at, had been practicing with the longbow since childhood. They were capable of hitting a man at 200 meters. Moreover, compared to the heavy French crossbows, which were slower to load but had a stronger draw, the English archers could fire up to 15 arrows in a minute. Thus, before the French reached the English line, about 100,000 arrows, almost a meter long, fell on them in a dive, like a rain of metal. Moreover, the mud hindered the movement of the horses, which were riddled at times. The melee barely lasted an hour. In an attempt to turn the day around, the French charged again, but again fell into Henry's trap, turning their force on the strongest corps of the English, who surrounded and defeated them. During the combat, Henry himself was wounded by a mace blow to the helmet, but after a short fight, the French were humiliated and frustrated, diverted their force into Henry's baggage convoy, killing his pages, who were almost all children. Henry, furious, had all the wounded and prisoners killed. That day, about 5,000 Frenchmen lost their lives, and only 200 English soldiers. Agincourt was undoubtedly the most disastrous of the French defeats in the 100 Years' War. As a consequence of the same one, in addition, Henry recovered for England all Normandy, and King Charles IV of France had to consent to give him the hand of his daughter, Catherine. Henry thus achieved his greatest wish, which, however, never came true. That's it for today, but don't worry, we're just getting started. Thanks for joining this historical ride, and get ready for more fun facts and stories in the next video. See you soon, time travelers.